Imagine if there were two voices in your mind, constantly guiding your decisions. One is quick and intuitive, making snap judgments in a heartbeat. The other is slower and more methodical, analyzing every detail before reaching a decision. Together, these voices, what psychologist Daniel Kahneman calls System 1 and System 2, shape every choice we make, big or small. And sometimes, these voices lead us astray without us even realizing it. Today, we're exploring Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, a groundbreaking book that peels back the layers of how our minds work. Kahneman, a Nobel laureate, uses decades of research to explain these two systems and the cognitive biases that can distort our judgment. In this video, you'll learn how these systems operate, why we sometimes make irrational choices, and, most importantly, how you can use this knowledge to make smarter decisions in everyday life. By the end, you'll walk away with a better understanding of how to spot mental shortcuts, avoid common biases, and make decisions that serve you well. So let's jump in and explore Thinking, Fast and Slow, unlocking the science behind the way we think. Chapter 1. The characters of the story. Kahneman introduces us to the two main players in the decision-making game, System 1 and System 2. System 1 operates automatically and quickly. It's the part of our brain that makes split-second decisions based on intuition, patterns, and past experiences. Think about it. When you hear a loud sound in a dark alley, your first instinct is to freeze or run. You don't analyze the situation consciously. Your mind reacts to the potential danger. That's System 1 at work. Instant, reflexive, and often life-saving. System 2, on the other hand, is slower, more deliberate, and requires conscious effort. It's the part of the brain that steps in when you're solving a math problem, reading a difficult text, or planning your next big move in life. For instance, imagine trying to figure out your budget for the month. You'll spend time adding up numbers, comparing options, and weighing your choices. It's tiring, and that's because System 2 requires energy and focus. Unlike System 1, System 2 isn't always activated unless something complex or important requires attention. Together, these two systems guide how we move through the world, making decisions, both big and small. But here's the twist. We often trust System 1 because it's fast and efficient, but sometimes it leads us astray. And that's what we'll explore next. So, we know these two systems are always at work, but how do they manage our thoughts and decisions when they're faced with too much information? Let's explore how mental effort and attention affect the way we think. Chapter 2. Attention and Effort. Kahneman makes an important observation. System 2, our thinking system, is lazy. And by lazy, he means it prefers not to engage unless absolutely necessary. It's like an athlete who only runs when they have to. In contrast, System 1 is always ready to react. It's on autopilot. But this mental laziness is crucial because we can only focus on one thing at a time. When you're multitasking, your brain isn't actually doing several things at once. Instead, you're constantly switching between tasks, which uses up precious mental energy. Imagine driving through familiar streets while having a conversation with someone. You're cruising along, barely thinking about the road, thanks to System 1. But when you hit a complicated intersection or a sudden detour, System 2 steps in. Your mind shifts gears, paying closer attention to every detail, traffic signs, speed limits, pedestrians, everything, until you've safely passed the challenge. It's like going from autopilot mode to full-on concentration. But here's the catch. System 2 can only handle so much. Mental effort is limited, so once you've exhausted it, say after a long day of work, your brain gets tired and you're more likely to fall back on the shortcuts of System 1, even when you shouldn't. This is why after making complex decisions or facing a high-stress situation, we sometimes make mistakes or poor choices. We simply don't have the energy to think things through properly. Now that we understand how effort and focus play a role in our decision-making, let's explore how these systems shape the decisions we make, especially when it comes to trusting our judgment. Chapter 3. The Lazy Controller. System 2 is, as we've learned, a lazy controller. It often lets System 1 take charge, especially when the decision seems insignificant or doesn't require a deep analysis. But this is where things can go wrong. Imagine you've walked into a room where you've been before and you automatically assume you know where everything is. Without even thinking, you reach for a familiar object, only to realize it's in the wrong spot. That's System 1 at work, relying on experience and jumping to conclusions, even when they're not accurate. But sometimes, System 2 needs to take the wheel, especially in more complex or unfamiliar situations. If you're about to make an important financial decision, for example, you'll want to pause and engage System 2. Don't trust the gut feeling that says you should buy something just because it's on sale. System 2 helps you think through the consequences and make choices that align with your long-term goals. Kahneman emphasizes that System 2 isn't lazy by nature, but it has its limits. When it's engaged, it helps us reason carefully. But when we're mentally drained or the decision doesn't seem urgent, System 1 jumps in, saving energy but potentially making mistakes. So, we know that System 2's laziness can lead us into trouble, but how does this affect how we judge others and the world around us? Let's look at the role of intuition and where it leads us right and wrong. Chapter 4. The Associative Machine. System 1 is constantly linking information, forming patterns, and creating associations based on past experiences. It's like a massive library in your brain, constantly connecting dots. For example, if you've been in a difficult situation before, like giving a speech, your mind recalls that feeling of anxiety, and you're instantly reminded of how to manage it, even before you consciously know you're anxious. However, this associative process can also get us into trouble. Think about how we form stereotypes based on limited information. For instance, if you've had a negative experience with someone from a specific group, your brain might automatically associate everyone from that group with the same qualities, without any conscious effort. System 1 operates on this automatic pattern recognition mode, but it can sometimes create false associations that lead us to inaccurate conclusions. This is where things like racial bias and snap judgments creep in. Kahneman shows us that while intuition can be incredibly powerful, especially in experts who've had years of experience, it can also be faulty. And that's because it operates on shortcuts, often skipping important details that System 2 might catch. Now that we know how our mind connects patterns automatically, let's dive into how cognitive ease and familiarity can affect our beliefs and actions. Chapter 5. Cognitive Ease. Cognitive ease refers to how easily information flows through your brain. The easier something feels to understand, the more likely you are to trust it. If information is presented clearly or in a familiar context, your brain perceives it as true, even if it's not. For example, if you read a headline that says, "Studies prove that eating vegetables boosts your energy," you're more likely to believe it because it sounds simple and intuitive. However, this ease can also be deceptive. The easier something is to process, the more you might believe it, even if the message is misleading or inaccurate. Kahneman explains that the familiarity effect often leads us to believe things just because we've heard them before. If a claim has been repeated often enough, it feels more credible. This is why advertisers use catchy phrases and simple slogans. They make you feel like the product is trustworthy without providing real evidence. So, while cognitive ease helps us process the world more efficiently, it also makes us vulnerable to false truths and shortcuts. Chapter 6. Anchoring. The Power of First Impressions. One of the most fascinating biases is anchoring, the tendency to rely heavily on the first piece of information we encounter when making decisions. This anchor can significantly influence our judgment, even if the information is irrelevant or misleading. Let's say you're at an auction and a painting is initially listed for $10,000. The auctioneer then lowers the price to $7,000. Even though $7,000 may still seem expensive, you may feel like it's a good deal, just because the initial $10,000 price tag anchored your perception of value. In everyday life, anchoring happens all the time. For example, think about when you're shopping for a car. The first car you see is priced at $50,000, and then you look at a similar model that costs $40,000. Suddenly, that $40,000 car seems like a steal, even if it's still beyond your budget. The high anchor has skewed your perception of what's reasonable. Even the way we negotiate is influenced by anchoring. If you're negotiating a salary and the first number mentioned is high, it can set the bar for the entire negotiation, even if it's unrealistic. You might find yourself adjusting expectations based on that initial figure. But here's the catch. Anchors can be arbitrary. Research has shown that even random numbers, like someone's birth year or the last 2 digits of a phone number, can serve as anchors that shape our decisions. This is a subtle but powerful bias that affects nearly every decision we make. Now that we've explored how our minds latch onto first impressions, let's turn to another cognitive shortcut that's always in play: availability. Have you ever overestimated the likelihood of an event just because it's fresh in your mind? Let's take a deeper look. Chapter 7: Availability Bias. What we see is what we believe. The availability bias occurs when we judge the probability of an event based on how easily examples come to mind. It's our brain's way of shortcutting complex probabilities. If you're constantly hearing about plane crashes on the news, you might begin to think flying is much more dangerous than it is. The reality is that air travel is incredibly safe, but the frequency with which these events are reported makes them more memorable and therefore more likely to influence your thinking. This bias can also affect our everyday choices. Let's say you're planning a vacation and a friend recently had a bad experience at a resort. Even though the resort has many positive reviews and is generally well-rated, the one negative story will stick with you, and you'll subconsciously assume it's a risky choice. It's not that the negative experience represents the norm, but because it's more vivid and recent in your memory, it becomes disproportionately influential in your decision-making. The availability bias doesn't just apply to large events like plane crashes. It influences all kinds of decisions. For example, when choosing which movie to watch, if you've recently seen an advertisement for a blockbuster film, that movie is likely to be the first one you consider, simply because it's more readily available in your mind, even though there may be better options out there. Now that we understand how our memories and experiences shape our judgments, let's explore another mental shortcut: representativeness. How we compare new information to what we already know. Chapter 8: Representativeness. Making assumptions based on patterns. The representativeness heuristic is when we make judgments about the likelihood of an event based on how similar it is to a prototype in our minds. Essentially, it's when we assume something belongs to a certain category based on how it fits a typical example, even if it's not accurate. A classic example of this bias is seen in hiring decisions. Imagine a company is looking to hire a new employee, and they have 2 candidates. One is a highly qualified professional with years of experience, and the other is a recent graduate with no experience but who fits the ideal image of what the company typically hires: young, energetic, and charismatic. Many decision-makers might choose the graduate, thinking they represent the type of person the company should hire, even though the experienced candidate may be more suited for the role. The graduate just fits the mental prototype more closely. This bias often leads us to make decisions based on stereotypes. For example, if someone doesn't fit your idea of a successful person, you might automatically assume they can't be successful, even if the facts suggest otherwise. Our brains tend to compare new information to past experiences, leading us to make assumptions based on these patterns. But this is not always the most accurate way to make decisions. So far, we've seen how biases affect the way we judge risk and make decisions. But biases also influence how we evaluate probabilities, even when we have access to facts. Let's dive into how framing effects can change our decisions in subtle, yet powerful ways. Chapter 9: Framing. The influence of context on decision-making. The framing effect occurs when the way information is presented influences how we perceive it. It's the classic example of how the same piece of information can lead to different decisions depending on how it's framed. Take health decisions as an example. If a doctor tells you that a treatment has a 90% success rate, you're more likely to be optimistic and willing to undergo the treatment. But if the same doctor frames the information as 10% of people fail to recover, you might feel hesitant or even reject the treatment altogether, even though both pieces of information are saying the same thing. This bias also shows up in advertising. Consider the difference between saying a product is 95% fat-free versus 5% fat. The first phrasing sounds healthier, even though they are essentially saying the same thing. This subtle manipulation of how information is framed can greatly affect our decisions, even if we think we're making a rational choice. The power of framing can be seen in everything from political campaigns to product advertisements. The way a message is worded can influence your perception of it, even if the facts are identical. As we've learned, subtle changes in how information is presented can sway our decisions. Now, let's look at how our need for certainty and simplicity drives us to make overconfident choices. Chapter 10: Overconfidence Bias. When we think we know more than we do. The overconfidence bias is a cognitive trap that leads us to believe that we know more than we do, and to take risks we shouldn't. This bias often causes people to make decisions with more certainty than the situation warrants. For example, imagine you're planning a road trip and you're confident about your ability to navigate, even though you've never been to the destination before. You might skip checking a map or using GPS because you're overconfident in your ability to find your way. But what happens? You get lost because you overestimated your knowledge and underestimated the complexities of the route. In the business world, this bias can be seen when entrepreneurs overestimate their chances of success. A new startup founder might believe their idea is foolproof, leading them to take bigger risks or overcommit resources. Overconfidence is dangerous because it leads to poor decisions and underestimation of risks, all because we think we know better than we do. Chapter 11: The Illusion of Knowledge. We've all been there. That feeling of certainty when we make a decision, convinced that we know exactly how things are going to turn out. This is the power of overconfidence, a cognitive bias that makes us believe we understand the world better than we actually do. Whether it's predicting the outcome of a game or our ability to manage a challenging project, overconfidence often leads us to underestimate risks, overestimate our abilities, and ultimately make poor decisions. Think about when you've driven somewhere for the first time and decided to skip the GPS. Maybe you think, "I've been to similar places before, I'll be fine." Then, an hour later, you realize you're hopelessly lost, and what should have been a 20-minute drive turned into a frustrating, time-consuming detour. This is overconfidence bias in action, underestimating the complexities of a situation because we believe we know more than we do. The trouble with overconfidence is that it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more certain we feel, the less we tend to check our assumptions or seek advice from others. In reality, our knowledge is often incomplete, and our predictions frequently miss the mark. Daniel Kahneman refers to this as the illusion of knowledge, where the more we know, the more confident we become about how much we understand, when in fact, we might know very little. Now that we've seen how overconfidence distorts our sense of what we know, let's dive into how this overestimation of ability impacts our decisions, particularly in situations that demand precision and careful judgment. Chapter 12: The Planning Fallacy. Underestimating time and resources. Overconfidence doesn't just impact what we think we know. It also affects how we manage time, resources, and expectations. Take the planning fallacy, for example. It's the tendency for people to underestimate how long a task will take or how many resources it will require, even when they've experienced similar projects before. Imagine you're organizing a party and you're confident that you can prepare everything in just 2 hours. You've done it before, so it should be fine, right? But 2 hours into the task, you're rushing to finish, and it's clear you were overconfident in your planning. In reality, the time it takes to accomplish any task is often longer than we estimate, and the planning fallacy emerges because we ignore past experiences where tasks took longer. This bias is particularly problematic in the business world. Entrepreneurs often fall into the trap of believing their startup will be an instant success, underestimating the time, capital, and effort required to bring their idea to life. Similarly, managers sometimes fail to anticipate the challenges that might arise in a project, leading to delays and increased costs. The overconfidence of expecting smooth sailing can cause setbacks because we're not prepared for the bumps along the way. So far, we've seen how overconfidence influences both our predictions and our time management. But what about when this bias affects how we make decisions in high-stakes situations? Let's explore how overconfidence shapes our judgment in risk-related scenarios. Chapter 13: The Perils of Overconfidence in Risk-Taking. The more confident we are in our abilities, the more likely we are to take risks that we shouldn't. Overconfidence leads us to believe we can control outcomes that are, in fact, uncertain. This often plays out in financial decisions, where people overestimate their ability to predict the stock market or the success of an investment. The belief that you can beat the market by making quick, high-stakes decisions is a common mistake. Let's think about gambling for a moment. It's easy to see how overconfidence works here. You've won a few rounds, and now you feel like you've got the hang of it. You convince yourself that the odds are on your side, even though the numbers haven't changed. This overconfidence might lead you to take even bigger bets, and before you know it, you've lost more than you planned to. In the world of business, overconfidence and risk-taking often leads to irrational exuberance. The belief that investments, strategies, or new products are guaranteed successes. Remember the tech bubble of the early 2000s? Investors overestimated their ability to predict the future, which led to massive financial losses. This was a classic case of overconfidence skewing judgment and driving people to make riskier choices than they should have. While overconfidence can make us take unnecessary risks, it also has a powerful grip on our ability to evaluate information. Let's now turn our attention to how confirmation bias feeds into overconfidence and distorts our judgment. Chapter 14: Confirmation Bias. Seeking what we want to hear. Overconfidence is often fueled by confirmation bias, the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. This bias keeps us in our comfort zones, reinforcing our confidence even when the evidence is incomplete or contradictory. For instance, imagine you're convinced that a certain diet will help you lose weight. Whenever you read an article that supports your belief, you latch onto it, ignoring any conflicting evidence. Even though studies are showing that the diet doesn't work for everyone, your overconfidence in the idea causes you to only seek out information that confirms what you already think. This bias is particularly dangerous because it prevents growth. By only looking for information that supports your beliefs, you stop questioning your assumptions. This is why people can remain stubbornly confident in their opinions, even in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. Over time, this can lead to poor decision-making because you're not open to new perspectives or corrections. After examining how confirmation bias helps us reinforce our overconfidence, let's now explore how overconfidence distorts our ability to recognize failure and learn from mistakes. Chapter 15: The Backfire Effect. Denying our mistakes. The backfire effect occurs when people are confronted with evidence that contradicts their beliefs, and instead of adjusting their views, they double down on their original position. This is an extreme form of overconfidence where, rather than admitting we were wrong, we become more entrenched in our mistaken beliefs. Let's consider a simple example. Imagine you're watching a sports match, and you're convinced that one team is going to win. As the game progresses, it becomes clear that your team is losing. Instead of acknowledging that your prediction was off, you start justifying your belief by pointing out small details that support your view. You ignore the obvious signs and focus on minor evidence that backs up your initial prediction. This is overconfidence at its most dangerous, denying reality because you don't want to admit you were wrong. In a professional context, overconfidence often leads to failure to learn from mistakes. When leaders ignore or dismiss feedback, it creates an environment where poor decisions go uncorrected. If you can't acknowledge failure, you can't improve. Chapter 16: Risk and Reward. How we evaluate choices. We all face decisions in life, big or small. Some are easy, while others seem to come with a heavy price. But did you know that we often make these decisions based not on rational thinking, but on how we perceive potential losses and gains? This is the core of prospect theory, a concept introduced by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, which challenges the traditional notion of decision-making. Imagine you're offered two choices, a guaranteed gain of $500 or a 50% chance to win $1,000. Most people would opt for the first option, a guaranteed $500. Now, flip the scenario. You lose $500, and you're given the choice between losing an additional $250 or taking a 50% chance to lose $500. More people would rather take the gamble than face the sure loss. This preference for avoiding losses, even when it doesn't make logical sense, is a key element of prospect theory. What does this tell us about how we make decisions? The human brain is wired to fear loss more than it values gain, a phenomenon known as loss aversion. Losing something feels far worse than gaining something of equal value feels good. This bias influences everything from financial decisions to personal relationships, pushing us to act in ways that protect us from perceived threats, even at the cost of better outcomes. Having seen how loss aversion shapes our choices, let's explore how this bias doesn't just affect how we deal with money, but also impacts other important aspects of our lives. Chapter 17: The Certainty Effect. How we overvalue security. In our decision-making process, we often find ourselves favoring certainty over uncertainty, even when the uncertain option might actually offer a better outcome. This is known as the certainty effect, and it can lead us to make suboptimal choices. For example, let's say you're at a job interview and you're offered two choices. The first is a solid, stable job with a predictable income but no growth potential. The second is a riskier role at a startup, with the possibility of a higher salary and personal development, but also the risk of failure. Many people would choose the first option, that safe job, because it promises certainty, even if it comes with a trade-off of stagnation. The certainty effect explains why we often avoid taking risks, even if the potential rewards might outweigh the security of the known. This preference for the known over the unknown can be observed in every aspect of life, from career decisions to investments. By recognizing the certainty effect, we can become more aware of how our desire for security might be leading us to make less than ideal choices. Now that we've seen how our preference for certainty can limit us, let's take a deeper look at how framing can influence the choices we make, and how the way options are presented can radically change our decision-making. Chapter 18, The Framing Effect, How the Presentation of Choices Shapes Our Decisions. How a choice is framed can drastically impact how we perceive it, even if the options themselves are the same. This is known as the framing effect. When faced with a decision, the way it's presented to us, whether as a gain or as a loss, can dramatically alter the choices we make. For example, consider the following two scenarios. A doctor tells you, there is a 90% survival rate for this surgery, or the doctor says, there is a 10% chance that the surgery will fail. Both statements are technically the same. The survival rate is 90% and the failure rate is 10%. But framing them in these two different ways will elicit different emotional responses. The first option sounds reassuring, while the second sounds far more risky, even though they're mathematically identical. This bias is deeply ingrained in how we process information. This also explains why advertisements, political campaigns, and even everyday sales tactics use framing to persuade us. It's all about presenting choices in a way that makes them seem more appealing or more dangerous, depending on what the marketer or decision-maker wants to achieve. Chapter 19, The Experiencing Self versus the Remembering Self. Ever been on an amazing vacation that you couldn't wait to go on, but when you reflect on it, you realize that only a few moments stand out? Why does the memory of the vacation seem so different from the experience? This is where Daniel Kahneman introduces the concept of the experiencing self and the remembering self, two separate aspects of our perception that shape our happiness and memories. The experiencing self is the part of us that lives in the moment, feeling the experiences as they happen. When you're at a party, enjoying good company and delicious food, it's the experiencing self that's savoring those moments. However, it's the remembering self that controls how you look back on those experiences. The difference between these two selves becomes clear when we look at how we evaluate our happiness. The experiencing self is often focused on the present, on the here and now, while the remembering self tends to focus on the overall narrative, picking out the most intense or emotionally significant moments. This means that we might remember a vacation as amazing because of one spectacular event, even though the majority of the experience was ordinary. Now that we've explored the difference between the experiencing self and the remembering self, let's delve deeper into how these two selves shape our happiness, and how the remembering self can lead us to seek pleasure in ways that don't always match the present moment. Chapter 20, The Peak End Rule. Why we remember peaks, not the whole journey. The peak end rule is a fascinating concept that explains why we often remember the most extreme moments of an experience, whether positive or negative, rather than the average experience itself. This rule states that our memories are primarily shaped by the highest or lowest point of an experience and how it ends. Take going to a concert as an example. You might be enjoying the whole show, but if the final song is a high-energy hit that connects with the crowd, that's what you'll remember. Alternatively, if the last song is a letdown, your memory of the concert might be negative despite having enjoyed the rest of the event. This effect is so powerful that it influences everything from vacations to medical procedures. So, when you look back on an experience, your brain doesn't average out the entire event. It fixes on the peak, the most intense moment, and the end. This rule helps explain why some experiences seem more fulfilling or disappointing than they were. While we often remember experiences based on peaks and endings, our experiencing self and remembering self don't always align. In the next chapter, we'll explore how we can use this knowledge to make better decisions about what will bring us happiness. Chapter 21: Improving Happiness. Making choices with both selves in mind. Understanding the difference between the experiencing self and the remembering self can change how we approach happiness. Since the remembering self has such a powerful influence on our life satisfaction, we can make choices that maximize those peak moments, creating more fulfilling memories in the long run. For instance, when planning a vacation, focusing on a few high-impact experiences that will create lasting memories can result in a trip that feels much more rewarding than one that's merely filled with constant pleasure. The same can be said for everyday life. Planning moments that you can reflect on fondly later, whether it's a special dinner or a significant milestone, can lead to a richer sense of happiness. By understanding how we evaluate our experiences, we can begin to make decisions that not only feel good at the moment, but also leave us with positive memories that last. And there you have it. We've taken a deep dive into the complex workings of the mind, explored how our thinking is shaped by two systems, how biases sneak into our decisions, and how we evaluate the choices we make based on our fears of loss and our desires for gain. We've even looked at how our perception of happiness is divided between the experiencing and remembering selves. What we've learned today is that human decision-making isn't as straightforward as it seems. It's influenced by cognitive shortcuts, biases, and the way we frame choices. But the more we understand these processes, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions, whether it's about finances, relationships, career moves, or personal happiness. The key takeaway here? We're not always the rational thinkers we believe ourselves to be. However, by recognizing our cognitive biases, understanding the role of framing, and mindfully leveraging our experiences, we can become more aware of how we're making decisions and ultimately make better ones. If this exploration into how we think, decide, and reflect has sparked your curiosity, don't stop here. Start applying these concepts to your own life. Take a moment to reflect on the last big decision you made. How much of it was influenced by biases like overconfidence or the framing effect? Can you think of a recent choice where loss aversion may have taken the lead? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you're going to use this knowledge in your own decision-making process. If you found this video helpful, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth analyses and insights into psychology, decision-making, and personal growth. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's continue this journey of self-improvement together. And remember, making better decisions is a skill you can develop. Keep thinking, keep learning, and keep growing.